everybody, Questwise here, and I wasn't planning on doing a video tonight, but I felt inspired to tell you a story. So, usually on Tuesday nights, my wife and I, we go and we have sort of game night at a local gaming store with some friends of ours. My wife is not a gamer, but we've been playing Lorcana with our friends, and our plans got changed tonight. My wife had some other plans to go to, and a few of the other people canceled. So I decided I was just going to stay home, enjoy a quiet evening by myself, and break out a solo game or two. Play a couple things by myself while I listen to music or watch TV or something. And it got me to thinking about my career as a gamer, as my lifelong sort of hobby of gaming and role playing and miniature gaming, and some of the things I have planned coming up throughout the winter. Usually in the winter, I try to do some kind of a special project, something that's gonna take some downtime to do, because living here where I do in northern Michigan, the winters can be kind of brutal, and sometimes you just don't have a choice. You just don't want to leave the house out of safety, out of just don't want to deal with the snow, right? So usually in the wintertime, I pick a project of something I can work on that will give me some enjoyment while I have a lot of downtime at home. This year, and I'll be going into this in a completely separate video, but this year I have some cool project planned. Something I didn't plan on doing at first, but it sort of got handed to me, sort of set into my lap by a friend here locally, and now I'm super excited about it. But what I wanted to talk to you about tonight is I want to talk to you about a story about how my gaming tastes have evolved and yet not evolved, if that makes any sense at all. When I was in high school, I graduated in 1993, so it must have been around probably 1990, 1991. I loved comic books. I loved fantasy novels. I hadn't yet discovered Dungeons and Dragons. I kind of knew what it was. I had an uncle who had maybe played a couple of times. He had told me about it. I had watched the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon that used to be on Saturday mornings. But beyond that, I didn't really know what role-playing was yet. I hadn't discovered that yet. That would come a little bit later, during one of the summers, while visiting my some family downstate. But if you've watched the channel at all, you've heard this story told a number of times. But I don't think I've ever told this story. And as I sat here tonight playing some solo games, I was reminded of this time before I knew what tabletop gaming really was. But I had loved comic books. I had loved fantasy novels. I had read The Lord of the Rings. I had fallen in love with Terry Brooks' Shannara series. And I remember one day, a friend of mine had told me, hey, during lunch, I want you to come to the library because I have a cool thing I want to share with you and some other people. So I eat lunch really quickly. I go to the library, and he has on the table graph paper, and on it just drawn a room, and in a box to the side he had a whole bunch of metal miniatures, probably lead at the time. I'm not sure if they had switched to pewter at that point, but I don't even know where he got them from. I don't know if they were from his dad or from an uncle, or he had just purchased them, but there was a box full of lead miniatures, metal miniatures. They were not painted. Fantasy miniatures. My guess is probably Rel Partha. That was that sort of time period, right? And I was instantly intrigued. And as we sat down at the table, it was myself and my friend and a few other people. He told us that we're going to go explore a dungeon, and we're and that's I kind of left it at that. He had some dice, and again, it's such a long time ago that my memory of it's sort of vague as to like what kind of dice. Where was it? Just 6-sided dice? Was it polyhedral dice? I don't remember that aspect. I remember the miniatures. I remember the graph paper, and he slowly told us to pick a miniature that was going to be our character, and then put it into the room on the graph paper. And then began to describe to us that there's a door in front of us, and one of us decided we're going to open the door, and we moved from room to room through this thing. And every time we'd move into a room, some kind of creature would appear, right? So you'd pull another miniature out of this box, and we fought all manner of things, from giant spiders to rats to minotaurs. And that's how we spent our lunch hour, as we spent this entire time moving from room to room on graph paper and exploring a dungeon. I don't remember having character sheets. I think we may have just had scratch paper and said, hey, you have this many hit points. You have a sword. This is what you roll. Again, I don't remember the finer details of the encounter were hazy, but it had a profound impact on me. And it was later when I learned about role-playing games, when a friend, and you've heard this story before if you've watched the channel at all, a friend of my cousin's had introduced me to Palladium books, and we had done Ninjas and Super Spies and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness, Heroes Unlimited, and then later Rifts. And then I came back home to northern Michigan, and even though Palladium is a Michigan company, had not sort of made it to my area where I lived yet. But in a Walden Books in our mall, they had Dungeons and Dragons, second edition, advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And I remember mowing lawns so that I could buy a set of dice and a player's handbook. And I didn't really know anybody who even played yet, but I was really intrigued. I was enthralled by the idea of creating stories. And now, over the years, I've played a bajillion different games. Everything from modern games, science fiction, to horror, to fantasy. But as I sat down tonight, and tonight I was playing D100 Dungeon. This is a game by Martin Knight, and it is a solo game where you explore dungeons and you map out the dungeons as you move along. You fight monsters and you collect treasure and you have quests to go on. The current quest I'm doing right now is I'm searching for some medicine to heal a village. And these games, these books are amazing. If you haven't checked them out, I highly recommend it. Just Google D100 Dungeon. And the only one you really need is book 1 to kind of get into this whole thing. But there's like 8 other books. And tonight I'm just playing the basic game. I haven't played this in a while, so I wanted to get reacclimated to the rules and the ideas behind it. It's very, very old school. And it sort of touches a very nostalgic part of my heart, in that it's very simple. It's very basic. Now there's a ton of charts, and this is not the game for you if you do not like clerical work, if you do not like keeping track of health and damaged equipment and inventory. If you're not into that, this is not the game for you. But I quite enjoy that kind of stuff. But it really harkens back to a time, well, not when things were simpler, but back to a time when your imagination filled in all the blank areas. A lot of times today, especially in the modern era with video games and the way that they are, and nothing against video games, because there's amazing stuff out there right now, but it leaves very little to the imagination. These designers have done all that work for you. If you're playing a dungeon crawl, say Skyrim or or any of that series of games where you're exploring a world and creating a character. That's all from role-playing games. But the designers of that game have already filled in all the sort of background material for you. And while you're experiencing a story, it's a story that they've already told. And it's very visual. Everything's there. You don't have to imagine the mountain because it's there. It's visualized for you. The forest, the enemies, the skeleton warriors you might be fighting. It's all there. But I find that there's something very unique and at least for me, and it might be my age. I mean, you can see the gray in my beard. And I'll be 49 years old this year. But there's something about the simplistic nature. There's something about the way that games like D100 Dungeon spark your imagination and force you to imagine things. Because really, this is my map sheet, right? It's just squares, different colored squares, which means something in the game. And there are some descriptions of, like what you might find in there. And I've added a few things. I have these old cards from the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the trading card sets. This is what I envision my character to be. So I have a couple little play aids that kind of make it more beneficial to me, because it's a solo game. It's really only benefiting me. But I find something very magical about games that make you and spark in you an imagination, that I have to sort of fill in those things in my mind. They're not there in front of me. When I read a description in this book of what I find, it might say this was an old library. And most of the books are damaged or destroyed, but you find a few on the shelf that have a couple of magical spells listed in them. To me, I always take sort of a moment and immerse myself in that in my head, right? And I love games that allow me to do those kind of things. And to me, that's what old school games are. They were games that didn't have a lot of flash. They didn't have lots of great fancy art, colorful art. They had beautiful art, but it generally wasn't colored. It was a lot of line drawn art. The second edition AD&D did have some color plates by people like Larry Elmore, and great artists like that. But for the most part, it made you sort of fill in. And I think that's what most role-playing games do, is that when you're listening and you're interacting with other people and you're telling a cooperative story. But for me, there's something just very unique and very fun about a game that is just a hex map or just squares on a paper, and I have to fill in the rest with my imagination. Soon, probably next week, I'll be putting up a video of my winter project. A local friend of mine and I, he introduced me to a game that I didn't know anything about. And it's a mass battles miniature game made by Rel Partha back in the 80s, when Rel Partha was sort of the king of miniature producers. And I didn't know anything about that. They had rules for mass battles, and it's called Chaos Wars. And all the rules for it are free online, and I'll share that next week when I do the video on what I'm going to be doing. But as I began to read through it, it began to spark my imagination even more, right? It's normally a 25 millimeter miniature range. We're going to reduce it down to 6 millimeters so we can have these epic, big, grand battles on a kitchen table. But it got me to thinking that there's more to that game than just mass battles on a table. And I love the old school nature of that too. I love, harkens back to things like Warhammer, but which is very modern nowadays. But I want the old gritty miniatures. I want those old metal, clunky looking, beautiful miniatures of a time where you had a wizard that just pointy hat and a staff, and you had to sort of fill in the rest. What does this guy do? What does he look like? What does he act like? But I'm going to be blending the Realpartha Chaos Wars miniature game with Steve Jackson's early role-playing game, The Fantasy Trip. And the Fantasy Trip, if you don't know, is sort of the precursor to GURPS, which was the biggest hit for him, I think. GURPS stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System. And GURPS had it was tons and tons of different source books. And while the game itself became very cluttered, the source books were beyond anything I've ever seen before. Source books on space and how space worked and space travel and discovering planets and what we might find on planets that you discover. And his fantasy one had not only just the basic sort of characters like elves and dwarves and humans and stuff and halflings, but he had like all sorts of manner of crazy different stuff. But the precursor to GURPS was called the Fantasy Trip, and it began with a box called Melee and Wizard. And in that, you had these little paper tokens. I'm going to use miniatures for it, but paper tokens on a hex grid where you fought. And the hex grid was black and white. So you had to sort of fill in your imagination. When I went off to college after high school, I met a lot of people who played D&D, and we played a lot of D&D. But then we also got into things like Warhammer 40K, Blood Bowl. And these games had a lot more visualization to them, but we were poor college students, so we didn't have terrain tables full of buildings and trees and whatnot. No, we had stacks of books that made tables or buildings. We had paper towel tubes that were columns or trees. Our game table was actually a piece of 4x4 plywood balanced on the back of 2 chairs. And we loved it. We were enthralled by it. And so I got some time to reflect tonight. And, just breaking out D100 Dungeon and thinking about doing stuff with the Fantasy Trip and Chaos Wars from Realpartha. It really got me to realizing that I love this kind of stuff. This is my bread and butter. This is where I really thrive. I've played a lot of other games, and I've left a lot of other games, left a lot of those games that I thought were really, really cool, and they are really, really cool. But there was always something missing in it for me. And for me, it was this kind of stuff. This stuff that's very basic, not simple, but basic in its approach, and enthralling to me to be able to use my imagination to fill in those gray areas, those blank canvases, that I can make those worlds my own. And again, like I said, this video was kind of impromptu. I wasn't planning on doing anything, and I was just going to play through this while I had the house to myself, but I just wanted to share this with you. I figured you as my viewers, if you've stuck around with me for any length of time, you might find this enjoyable, this little sort of fireside chat, this little TED Talk, I guess, as it is. But if you like those kind of things, if you enjoy these types of games, these very old school, basic, imagination sparking type of games, let me know in the comments down below, because I'd love to start a conversation about this. And like I said, next week I'm going to go into detail about my winter project and how I'm going to blend the Fantasy Trip role-playing game with some friends as my other friend and I begin to build these armies to play the Chaos Wars, the Realpartha rules for mass battles, and how we're going to incorporate those two ideas together. And I'll tell you why I chose in particular, the fantasy trip, to coordinate with the Relpartha rules. But thanks for sticking with me. This video is like 20 minutes long, and I know I've just been rambling, but it's just something I wanted to share, something I was ruminating on tonight, and I thought, as fans and members or viewers, you might enjoy this kind of a thing. So until next time, my friends, I'm Questwise. Please, as always, stay safe out there in this crazy world. And as always, game on.